Mm,
So let's talk about grief being a normal adaptation process to loss and change. And I suppose the first point of that is really thinking that loss is very normal in our life. Like that
absolutely.
happens. Yeah, the seasons change, you can grieve summer to autumn, to winter, to spring,
Mm,
changing of the years and changing jobs.
mhm.
And
Yep.
yeah, there's a whole, like, there is so many different losses and changes we experience with
Right.
life.
Yep. And the thing that we need to realize is that not all changes are equal. So, I mean, grief comes in when there's something that has been significant to you changes. So, when you experience a loss of something that was important to you, then you will be most likely to experience a grief process. We go through changes that don't really affect us. So, I mean, you might want to sit there and say, well, I throw out an old shirt. Okay, maybe I'm okay with that. Okay, there's no grief process attached to it because I've got nothing particularly attached to it. However, if it was the shirt that my mother made for me when I was X and it reminds me of this situation, so on, there's a whole lot of things that we've attached to that particular item. So that might be a stronger grieving process when you finally get to the stage where this shirt is worn out and I can no longer wear it. It no longer serves its purpose. But there can be this whole sense of I don't really want to let it go, because if I let it go, I've lost this connection to the person who made it and the situation in which I wore it initially, and what it was made for, that kind of stuff. So, I mean, it's funny, we get attached to all sorts of things.
Hmm.
And when that attachment gets broken in any way, there's likely to be a grief about that. But we don't attach to everything equally. So there might be something that's like, oh, it was just there, and I'm quite totally fine to let it go. And there's no real grieving about it at all. It's just like, yeah, it's time. But then
So,
there are other things that it's much more of a stronger process. It's much more obvious. It's much more challenging. Hmm.
so grief is really an indication that something is important to us, something about
Yep.
whatever is changing mattered to us.
Yep, it mattered to us, and there could even be a love that's involved with that. It's like something that you loved or something that was very meaningful to you is somehow not accessible in the way it has been. So, I mean, classic cases when somebody dies. I mean, you often have mixed feelings about that because because of the relationship that you had with that person. So we expect grief in that situation, but what we don't expect grief necessarily if you just move houses. We don't necessarily expect it if you change jobs, but there can be, depending upon the circumstances in which that happened and how that transition happens. And sometimes we can be so focused on where we're going to that we give no time for what we're leaving behind. And that, as we've just talked about previously, can be where the grief hits us at a later point because we haven't realized or made any space for reflecting on what it is that we've lost in the process of moving into this new space, whatever that might be.
And I suppose then that leads me to the question of what is grief? Like, if grief, while it is an adaptation to loss, it's also a series of physical experiences that we have in our body as well.
It incorporates a whole bunch of things, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on when we talk about grief being more than sadness. But yes, certainly, it's not just an emotional experience. It's something bigger than that, and it is a process. It's not just a one-time thing. And I think that's one of the myths that we get about grief is that, oh, if I've sat there and I've cried about it, I'm over it. And it's like, well, it's not really that simple. If it's something that's been really important to you, something that had significance for you, there's a hole left in your life when it's no longer accessible or no longer present. And it's not that you don't have memories, it's like the memories are still there. And that's part of the reason why you grieve, because you do remember what you had. But just the dealing with it, the adaptation takes time. And we often underestimate how much time it can take to work that through and become used to the absence of this thing that was really significant or important to us.
So let's talk, I know this is ahead of our agenda, but let's talk about time then. I was like, hang on, let's talk about time.
Yes.
Why does it have its own timetable? Why can't we just cry it out once and it's done? Like, why?
It would be nice if it was really simple, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I think my sense is that grief is an unfolding thing. It's like we kind of know what we've lost to a point, but then as we develop understanding or we go through new life experiences, it exposes other aspects of what it is that we've actually lost. So I mean, one of the things that is often said is that with a death is that don't really make any decisions until you've been through the first year, because I mean, the first year you actually go through all of the cycles of like the birthdays, the anniversaries, the special events, the Christmas and Easter, whatever it is that your holidays, all of those things where that person would normally be present, and having to work through all of that. I mean, it's intellectually, they're not going to be there, but the actual experience is not always the same thing as intellectually acknowledging that, hey, they're not here. You can feel the loss of some stuff when those times actually arrive. So, I mean, for example, my mother died in 2017. So one of her things was that she did Christmas stuff. And I mean, not that I was there for every Christmas as an adult, but there was just certain things that were her traditions for Christmas. There was certain music that she played. There were decorating the tree was something that's quite important. She had ornaments that she put up that we put up every year. There were things that she'd made that came out only at Christmas time. There were the special, the dishes that would come out, like not just the dishes that she cooked, but also like the special dishware that she would bring out for Christmas time only, and that kind of stuff. So my whole process, I mean, I've managed to inherit a little bit of some of the Christmas stuff because my father didn't really want to keep that. But there's a bit of a happy, sad thing when I go and put it out at Christmas time because it's a link to my mother. And so it's kind of like, I mean, she had a nativity scene that she carved. She had made it herself. And I mean, it's years old now. She did it when I was a child, and it's seen many, many years, and it's starting to look its age. But I can't really let it go because it's like my mother made this. It's like she and I remember all of the pieces that I remember her doing that. I remember where she got the idea from and what she modeled this nativity scene off, and it's like, yeah. So there's lots of really special things that go on, and so even though my mother has been gone for a few years, Christmas time still has a little tinge of sadness there with it, and it's just like, if she were here, this is the kind of thing that she would be doing. And I mean, for me, putting the Christmas stuff out is part of the way of touching in with my grief and honoring her memory. And even things like there were certain Christmas bickies that she used to make. And I make them now every year. It's just kind of like, it's one of the things that connects me with her. And that's just something that I do.
So carrying on traditions.
Yeah, carrying on traditions and allowing myself, if there are sad feelings that come up, just acknowledging them, allowing them to be there, because it's like, yeah, the Christmas can be an exciting time, and it was a season that my mother loved, and yeah, there's sort of a little bit of a not maudlin type of thing with that, but there's just a recognition. If my mother were here, this is the kind of things that she would be doing.
And recognizing that grief, I think, when it comes up, is a really important part of the process. The thing I found interesting when you were just talking was the sense that actually a lot of our grief or sense of loss is actually unconscious, and it takes time for it to surface and come into our conscious mind, especially when sometimes consciously we're so focused on what's logical or appropriate for the situation.
And I think as adults, we're particularly prone to that. However, as children, I think a lot of cases, we don't know what to do with loss because we haven't had enough life experience of it. So we look to adults to actually model for us what we need to do to be able to deal with the loss that we experience. And sometimes the modeling that we get doesn't allow a very broad spectrum of experience of the grieving process. So we end up feeling like, well, okay, my parents know that this has happened, or the adults that are in my world know that this has happened. This is how they're responding. This is how I need to respond. And it's not until later, as my own experience has been, that you actually start to begin to understand what that loss was about for me. And all of the feelings that are associated with that are feelings that a lot of times you weren't allowed to, or you didn't know that you could. You could actually sit with them. You didn't, and it can catch you by surprise. I know it did for me. It sort of suddenly finding myself, it's like, I'm remembering stuff from years and years and years ago that I haven't thought about, that suddenly there's some significance to that, and there's all this emotion. It's just like, where did that come from? And why now? And so the timetable thing, it's like, as I said, it can take years sometimes. And what I've actually found myself telling a lot of my clients, and telling myself in the process as well, is that if you've lost something that was significant to you, it never really goes away. So it's not that you're going to be copiously weeping about the loss that you've had, but it's like the loss is part of your history. And so it's never really going to disappear, which I think a lot of people hope it will, because it's
I
like,
certainly hope it will.
Yeah,
Like,
I don't want to feel it.
I don't want to feel this at all. No.
Yeah, it's not comfortable. And yet what I tell people is that the feelings that you're having are an indication of how important that thing was for you. It's not, if you could just brush it off, it obviously didn't mean a lot to you. But this thing, whatever it is that you're grieving, actually meant something to you. And the feelings that you're having and the experiences that you're having are actually an indication of like, hey, this was really important to me. I really valued this, and I miss it. And I miss it. It had some important things it had an important place in my life in the time that it was present. And I miss it not being here.
So I want to talk about, you mentioned earlier the seasons of grief, and I'm curious as to what each season is, because I think this also relates to a sense of timetable as well.
I think it's the way that it's presented in the seasons training is that different seasons mean different things to different people. So it's not like you start in winter with your sadness and you work your way through to spring. It's sort of like one of the explorations that is done very early on in that particular process is like, which season do you really like? Which seasons are really hard for you? And so on, and then mapping some feelings in relation to those kind of seasons. So it's like, if I'm in a winter season and I like winter and I have positive feelings about winter, that's not going to be a season where I'm going to be sad. So it's like winter might actually be I'm energized, I'm feeling like I can engage with the world, I'm feeling like I've got life, and the spring is coming and all that kind of stuff. So I mean, for me, autumn is that season for me. It's just like I love the autumn season, so I don't associate sadness with autumn. However, in my experience, summer is actually a more difficult time for me. And that has something to do with my own history. It's just like some of the biggest changes happened in the summertime for me, and so there's almost a visceral connection with, hey, that time of year evokes these kind of emotions because that was happening. I mean, it could be even calendar months. I know for me, January was difficult because January was often when changes happened, when we changed schools, when we changed countries, when we changed houses. And so it was just like, it got to a certain point in my teenage years where it was just like, I don't want to celebrate Christmas anymore because Christmas seems to always precede a major change. And I just don't like it. And I didn't understand that about myself for ages. I just reached this point when I was about 15 or 16 where it's just, I don't like Christmas. I really don't like Christmas. And it was not until I went to Africa in my 30s that I actually made the connection. that Christmas time there had been enough experiences of a Christmas time being then followed by a major move. So it's like, why would I want to celebrate Christmas? Because that's just going to be like inviting a major move to happen. So let's not do that. So let's avoid it. Let's avoid it. And hopefully in avoiding Christmas, we can then avoid January.
Just skip over January, skip over entirely.
But yeah. And I mean, I knew in my 20s that January I was down, and I never understood why. I just knew that that was just what happened. I never questioned it, never thought about it, but it was just like, I just feel really flat in January. But it was not until I was in my 30s after I'd come back from Africa that it was just like, that's what that's about. And finally, in acknowledging what was going on and the pattern that was going on, somehow I've now been able to engage differently with Christmas in January. January doesn't seem to be as much of a flat month as it used to be. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, but it's just not as prominent as it used to be, the whole flatness around January. It's just like, I've acknowledged January was a time when lots of difficult things happened. So when I come to January, I can anticipate that I might see something that recollects and brings me back to that space, but it doesn't have to be that way anymore. And I don't have to anticipate that the future is going to be a continuation of this pattern of like Christmas, then major change, which I think was part of the fear.
And so it's like really that sense of it's very personal and very individual to you.
Absolutely.
That there is no sort of set process. There is no sort of set time. There's no set way. It is your unique experience.
Yeah. And there are some theories about grief that describe grief that it comes in waves. So it's like it'll show up and then it will recede for a while and then it'll come back, and the strength of it might vary depending upon the wave that's coming through. Often you would think that the biggest wave would come right at the time that the loss happens, but that's not always the case. Sometimes it could come much later. So just because, depending upon what's going on around the loss at the time, or the other things that you're having to deal with, it may not necessarily hit until later, the intense wave, but then you'll have reminders that will trigger smaller waves perhaps, or maybe bigger waves, depending upon what's going on. And it's interesting too that the accumulation of griefs that you have over your life can sometimes feed into the experience of how I deal with a particular loss. It was interesting. I had just earlier this year, there was a family friend that unexpectedly passed away, had a heart attack, and nobody saw it coming. And I went to the funeral. And so this is like, my mother had died in 2017. I was reconnecting with my mother's loss, as well as the loss of this person who I did know, and was not hugely close to, but had some very positive memories of. So I had like the current loss, and then the past loss was in there. And then if I'd really wanted to think about it, I could have actually gone back and thought about my grandparents' loss back in the early 90s, mid to early 90s, and thought about their loss as well. So sometimes they can all get kind of conflated, sort of blend together in some ways. It's like, well, I'm actually grieving more than one thing in this particular event. So I mean, my experience in the Congo as I left the Congo was I had a really good time in the Congo. I really enjoyed my time there, and so I kind of was a bit sad about leaving that experience. But that leaving was connecting me also to older leavings, and so which is why I noticed this unusual sadness. It was just like, this seems to be a little bit stronger than I would have expected for the length of time I've been here. So, and that's one of the clues that you can identify that, hey, maybe there's something else going on. It's like, it's not just about what's going on now. And your mind can connect all sorts of things in all sorts of ways. It may not be a very clear cut, here's a leaving connecting me with another leaving. It could be this leaving connects me with a different experience that had similar feelings. So even though the situations might be very, very different.
But there's almost that sense of if something almost seems out of place, if this emotion just doesn't seem to fit the situation, that might be a clue that you are grieving or going through a loss adjustment process. I mean, that sounds very clinical, like we're risk managers. Listing the loss in the books.
Yeah, I mean, it could be an indication that you're in a grief process, or that you've tapped in. I guess there is a past grief and a present grief aspect to it. So it's like the intensity of what you're noticing could be an indicator that it's more than just the present loss that you're dealing with.
Yeah.
There could be old stuff.
Sorry.
No. There could be old stuff involved. Yeah.
What about grief? I've been calling it grief stacking, and you might have a more appropriate term for it, but where you have actually quite a few losses happen all at once that are otherwise unrelated. So last year I had a loss of a friend, my grandmother passed away, and our relationship ended in a very significant way. And all of those happened in the space of 3 weeks.
Yep.
And so
massive change.
Massive.
Yeah. Yep, and your world gets turned upside down with all of those kind of things, and it's interesting. It's interesting because I mean, I had a year like that back in the early 2000s. I had a year where it's like if anything could go wrong, it did go wrong. And so it's like here it was. It's like financial stress going on all year, a job that was uncertain that ended up disappearing, that I was hoping would continue, a relationship that started at the beginning of the year that ended in the middle of the year, physical exhaustion. I think it was actually it was the year that 9/11 happened as well. So it was just like, and I was living in the US at that time and was only just a couple of hours away from New York City where that happened, and knew people that were involved. And so I mean, it was a massive year. And I mean, I got to the end of that year, and then my year ended with my housemate saying that I had to find another place to live. And I'm going, can it get any worse? It's sort of like, but yeah, I mean, it was just like there were a whole bunch of reactions that I was having, and I didn't know how much I was carrying. Because it's just like one thing happened, and then another thing happened, and then before I could get a chance to get my head around that, another thing happened, and then it was just like and I was just in kind of this overdrive mode to try and avoid dealing with any of it because it was just overwhelming. But my body was not letting me get away with it. So it was just like, I mean, I had physical responses to that. I ended up with an experience of depression that I didn't know what to do with. And just finding myself overly busy and keeping myself busy to try and avoid my thoughts and my emotions. And I fell in a heap. So.
Yeah, I remember a couple of years ago, I went on a 2-week holiday with mum. And at the end of that, I went through some sort of loss process where I just went to a cubicle in the toilet in the airport and just broke down for reasons I couldn't quite fully understand. And then a week later, I had one of my great friends from Australia visiting for the weekend, and we went out and spent the weekend, drinking cocktails. And then she left, and I had a grief process with that as well. And all of those things backed up together, combined with all that alcohol, meant I just couldn't get out of bed for days. I couldn't get out of bed, and it was physical and emotional, and it was just everything all at once.
Yep. And the whole thing is that, I mean, our emotions are not separate from our bodies. Our thoughts are not separate from our bodies or our emotions. And so there's going to be ripple effects. If you're experiencing a loss, you experience it in your body, you experience it in your emotions, you experience it in your thoughts. And we're integrated beings. So to sit there and try and pretend that, like, oh, well, I'm going to put those thoughts aside. It's like, well, they don't go away. You might be able to park them, but they're still sitting there in the background, and the rest of your body actually knows they're there, even though you're trying to consciously deny that this thing is having an effect. It's like, no, I'm over it. I'm fine. I really am.
What? Denial doesn't work? Denial's great.
It does. Denial is a temporary measure. It's like it's got a function. It can be very, very helpful to help to get you to do the daily stuff, because it's like you can't sit in overwhelming emotion indefinitely. You've got a life to live still. But denial, by the same token, if you live in denial constantly, you're just compounding your experience because it just gets stuffed down. It doesn't go away. It doesn't disappear. It can starts to ripple out into other areas of your life because you're not giving it the attention it needs. You're not acknowledging it, and it will make itself known in ways that you may not recognize as being connected with the loss.